Hi, my name's Justin Schaff. I'm the founder here at Patch My PC.
And I am Cody Mathis. I'm an engineer here at Patch My PC.
In this video, we're going to be talking about something that's been coming up quite a bit lately around Cloud Management Gateway and specifically things to look out for with third-party updates. So we've been having, a few more support cases than I would say normal related to Cloud Management Gateway, specifically with some of the increased usage with coronavirus. So in this video, Cody and I are just going to walk through some of the things that we've seen and hopefully give you some tips to look out for to help you troubleshoot different scenarios for third-party patches and things that could potentially go wrong. So let's go ahead and get started. So first thing I think we're going to look at, Cody, was just kind of making sure CMG itself is functioning. So if we go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, so that's kind of the one thing that a common theme we're seeing in general is CMG is being treated like uh, mostly for first-party updates. That's one of the primary uses, and you kind of take advantage of the fact that that works without some of these additional configurations, and that's what we've kind of seen in the support cases.
Cool. So first thing, we'll just go through and just validate CMG is actually functioning. So this will be a good way to verify that the server out in Azure is actually running. It's being used as like a proxy, if you will, and that it has access to connect back to your site systems like your MP and your software update point to actually proxy that traffic from your clients out on the internet. So first step, this would be, what you want to make sure. You want to make sure that that traffic is in fact working and all these look good as far as the connection from CMG to your on-prem server. As far as that goes, I guess the next thing we can look at here is just the endpoint. So you want to make sure that you obviously have your software update point showing here as an endpoint. So you can see some basic information. One thing that you could also check out here is just, quick glance to see, hey, does it look like there's actually traffic and requests coming in over CMG to my software update point? So might be a good idea while you're in the CMG to actually glance over there, just make sure that you're seeing connections. Obviously, if there's little to nothing, it could potentially be something out on the CMG side that's not quite getting through. Next kind of basics, I think, would be validating that you've actually configured your site systems internally to be able to communicate with CMG. So if we're looking over here at our site systems, the first thing is going to be the management point, right? So if you need to go into more details on actually getting your certificates configured in your site systems, we do have a separate guide that will go into more context on how you get kind of some of those prerequisites configured. But for the point of kind of updates, you will obviously have to have a management point that is allowing traffic from CMG because your clients out on the internet, they will have to get policy to be able to know which software update point through CMG they can scan against and things like that.
And I will say this screen can be a little confusing. It looks like that checkbox for allow CMG traffic requires HTTPS, just kind of the spacing. It doesn't, right? So it can actually be HTTP and still allow CMG traffic, but that scenario is also going to require enhanced HTTP. So once you have enhanced HTTP enabled in your site settings, you're still going to be able to do HTTP plus allow CMG. So it's a little confusing in the view, but that is a configuration possibility.
Okay, let's cancel that. So in our case, we do in fact have like a PKI set up where our management point is issuing an actual SSL certificate. So that's why we have SSL or HTTPS in that, plus CMG. But yeah, if you're using enhanced HTTP like Cody was saying, you could potentially just have config manager kind of handle that certificate that would be used while still in HTTP, if you will, for internal clients. Cool. Next setting would be the sub. So in order for clients to actually scan, so they'd have to check their scanning against WSUS to get the applicability for any third-party updates. This also potentially applies for Microsoft updates as well if you have config manager as the update source in the event that you're co-managed, right? So, if you're pointing everything out to Windows Update for Business, this is a setting where you would still want to have that enabled specifically for third-party updates. They would still have to scan because those third-party updates would be specific to your WSUS server. Okay. So that's some of the basics from, once you've already got CMG set up, a few things that you would want to just spot check, before going too deep into troubleshooting. The next thing would be some of the things on the client settings. So we've had a few cases where the client settings did not actually allow for content downloads from Cloud Management Gateway. So for example, they had the option to allow clients to use CMG. So what that meant is, they would get their policies and they would even be able to scan against CMG. But the issue here is that, the distribution point also comes into play with third-party updates. You want to kind of talk a little bit more about, why that is, Cody, with the internal certs and things like that?
Yeah, so when we're dealing with third-party updates coming from your cloud management gateway or your cloud distribution point, one consideration that you've got to keep in mind is, especially if you are code signing them, your clients need to trust that code signing certificate. So it's not uncommon for self-signed certificates for code signing when you're doing third-party updates through Configuration Manager and WSUS. And that's perfectly fine. It's very common. But you need to keep in mind that your clients still need to trust that code signing certificate. We've seen some customers where they're starting to kind of move towards that cloud-only initiative, especially with everything that's going on right now. And they're in scenarios where they're firing up devices with autopilot. And they say, well, why aren't my third-party updates working anymore? All my other devices are working. And it turns out that, they don't trust that signing certificate anymore. It's not a valid signing certificate in that scenario. So you need to either go down, you got a couple different routes. You can either start getting a public code signing certificate and use that. That's pretty solid. You need to review kind of your company's security policy and see if that's preferred. Or alternatively, you can stop, and there's actually, well, aside from just code signing there, you've also got, like with Patch My PC, we code sign detection scripts as well, and the scripts themselves. So that is, again, another thing that has to be taken into consideration. You've got to trust all of your code signing certs across the board. It's something we've definitely seen customers run into.
Definitely. And one of the things that tie into that, since these updates are code signed using your certificate, it's not a scenario like Microsoft updates where, for example, let's say that you had the Access Cloud DPs totally off. And with Microsoft updates within your deployment, right, they can fall back and by default, they actually go directly out to Windows updates. But since there are some of those code signing requirements that Cody was mentioning, these are actually unique to your environment. So that's why from a cloud perspective in your client settings, you would need to ensure that clients are actually enabled to actually download content from your Cloud DP. And then from a certificate perspective, if you enable the client setting, assuming that they are co-managed where SCCM is still installed, this will allow ConfigMan to also kind of install that cert, especially if you're using like a self-signed cert where it's not natively trusted, like say a public CA, for example. Now, one additional option, you would want to ensure back on our CMG server that the Cloud DP functionality is also turned on. So that's a setting. If I go back to properties here, we do need to have CMG functioning as a Cloud DP under settings. And that's because since those updates are specific to your environment, you do have to have your third-party updates, those deployment packages for those distributed to CMG, because clients on the internet would need to download that content from Cloud Management Gateway. So coming back into that kind of perspective where we're talking about the packages, so quick look at what we're going to demo today. We're going to kind of go through and show you what this looks like on the client side. So for example, we do have a third-party update group. So if we come in here, we can see that we've got some updates. These are from our product, Patch My PC. But this scenario, we want to make it just some of the things to watch out for regardless of what you're doing with third-party updates. So for example, if you're using drivers or even any other potential catalog providers, for example, to make sure that you have things to look out for here. So this is basically just our third-party update group, but what's unique here is we did ensure that our deployment packages are distributed to CMG. So for example, just a quick peek here, we can see that we do have our CMG distribution point group and our actual Cloud DP. Okay, so with that said, let's go through and look under monitoring really quick. If you are having issues with clients, not having third-party updates and not having them work, one quick thing that you could look at is under the
Distribution status.
there we go, and then client data sources. So this will show us what content is going out over CMG to our clients. So, for example, we can see that a large portion of that is going to be our third-party updates within our environment for that data going through CMG for this deployment package. Okay. So on the client side, let's dig into some logs here. Now, this is a client that is managed through CMG. So we are actually totally out on the internet. And the first thing that we want to kind of validate is, are we actually scanning against updates? So the first step is going to be whether or not we can actually see the WSUS server, and more specifically, whether we're scanning against WSUS through Cloud Management Gateway. So one thing that would be a good first look would be location services. So if we go ahead and open that location services log, what we'll see here is we should see the WSUS path, and that should be pointing to CMG. And we should see that the reason for that is because, we're detecting that the client is directly on the internet, so we have no access to our, internal corporate network. So they would basically change the location from scanning against the internal WSUS server to actually proxying through CMG here.
And I think that's kind of what's interesting is, it's proxying through, right? The WSUS path is pointing off to your CMG, but ultimately that's not a software update point. You don't have a software update point in the cloud. And just like you don't actually have a management point in the cloud, you have a gateway, you have a proxy. And so it's a little bit different when you see that there, but it's how it's supposed to be.
Yeah, definitely. I think that is an interesting aspect there where if we actually look at kind of the endpoints, if you will, of what CMG is actually kind of proxying that traffic to, like we can specifically see for our software update point here, if we open up IIS,
yep,
we can see the two virtual directories that are relevant for scanning within our on-prem IIS server, right? So this is going to be our client web service and what's the other one here? Simple auth web. So this is basically going to go through and look at the WSUS, web calls and APIs that are required to do that scanning. And it's basically just that middleman is what CMG is doing out there, right? So, but this has a lot of value where you don't have to worry about doing things like DMZ servers, for example. What makes this nice is that once you get your connection point installed, it's basically just that connection from your on-prem server, and that's making the connection out to CMG to kind of broker this traffic, if you will. So this makes that process quite easy here. So looking back here, so we can see that scan data is looking pretty good. So in the event that you're not seeing your client actually detect the WSUS path is now going through CMG, there's a good chance that you have just something probably core not quite working right for the CMG setup, right? So maybe the client hasn't got policy if it was already on the internet and you added things, in the past, or, once they already did not have connection to detect this, or something else is going on where the software update point wasn't configured to be, configurable through CMG. So this is definitely a good place to start. The next kind of interesting thing here is scan agent. Do you want to talk a little more on that as we're looking at these logs?
The scan agent, if you've done some troubleshooting, on your devices and you're trying to figure out what the heck is going on with Windows updates because everybody loves them, hopefully you've opened this log because it's going to ultimately start giving you a little bit of info about is scanning actually happening, and like is it failing, is it succeeding? That's really kind of very valuable in this scenario. And I think specifically, let's see here, we were trying to get a little bit of info on like the differentiation between going out to Microsoft and going to your, your sub. And we're kind of poking at the categories, something I think we might investigate a little bit more, maybe see if we can get some extra info from the product group, because that's an interesting point, right? How is it differentiating where to get content and from? So that's something I think we want to dig into a little bit more.
Yeah, and one of the interesting things that kind of came up in that scenario is what if you have your Windows Update for Business policies? So let's say that, for example, you're using co-management, which we actually are in our environment, cloud services. Here we go, co-management. We do actually have our workload within Microsoft Intune. So we're pushing our Windows Update policies to Intune. But what's interesting about that is even though it is pointing to Intune or essentially Windows Update for Business, if you have your client setting enabled, so for example, if we go back and look at that client setting for third-party updates, we can see that we still have that setting enabled. So if we look back at the docs, so in the event that you still have, you still want to get third-party update scanning because that's only available through your on-prem WSUS and SUB. If you enable that setting, it's still going to allow you to get third-party updates, even if you are getting some of that scan data through Windows Update for Business. So that is one thing to note, where you can still get third-party patches through Config Manager, even if you wanted to kind of have some of that scan offloaded to Intune, for example. So definitely something to think about. If you do have some devices co-managed, you can still get your third-party patches configured and going here. Okay, so that looks good. So, at this point, we understand that, scanning is working. If we look at our updates deployment, that would kind of be the next log here in this process where, if we're getting scan data, are we actually getting the policy for our software update deployments? So for example, we can see here that everything does look good. So you'd want to make sure that you are getting that policy to tell your client like, hey, what software update groups are actually targeting, right? So this all looks good. Now at this point, we're going to switch over to Cody's client at his home, which would be coming over CMG, and this would be a fully internet-based client.
Yeah, so this is my device here, and this is a device that's never even touched the domain that the SCCM environment is on. It's always been internet-based. It's always gotten all of its information, its policy, its updates, its content from CMG. So Google Chrome's out of date here. We're going to go ahead and click Install. And what we're most interested in right now is going to be the data transfer service log. And what we've been seeing consistently is that we have a recurring failure to actually locate and download the content. And this is the error we see. You typically see it loop 3 times, but before it will actually successfully fail over. And it's an interesting error we're seeing here because we actually see it trying to grab content from, our server name port 80 and then content EA, which this structure makes sense. If you've done some WSUS work, you'd probably be familiar. This makes sense. The port's a little odd, but we'll work with it. And so if we, while we wait for this, we can anticipate this failing over usually a minute between each time. While we wait for that, what we can actually take a look at is in the console to kind of dig into that whole content path. If we actually pull up an update here in the console, we'll look at that Google Chrome update that we've got deployed. We can go and view that content information, and we can see the source path, right? This is where your SCCM console is actually going to reach out and download that content from. So when you right-click an update or you're doing a software update group deployment and you tell it to download the content to a deployment package, this is what SCCM is looking at. This is where it's actually going. So this is why you have a large WSUS content folder in a third-party update scenario. You are storing that content for SCCM to access on your server. So if we look at a Microsoft update, though, we're going to go into the properties and go into that same content location. The source path is going to be Microsoft download.windowsupdate.com. And this is, going to be that source path that your client's going to look at, so you don't need to host your content on your CMG. So let's see here. We are almost there.
Yeah, but what's interesting about this, let's open up I think it was the CAS log. Let's take a look at that, see what we're seeing in that. So if we look at that update, when we look at the distribution point, the line that has the WSUS server, so one up here. So what we think is actually happening is where it says locality, I think we're essentially from a config man client perspective, they're trying to hit Windows Update or Microsoft Update. That's where we can see the locality there, WUMU, which makes sense, right? Because that's going to be what a internet client would do. It would try to get its content directly from Microsoft Updates, right? Because it wouldn't make sense to go back on-prem, and it wouldn't make sense to download from CMG because it's already freely available. So what we think is actually happening here, and we've let the product group know, this scenario. But what's happening is if we go back to data transfer service, it's basically saying, okay, cool, let me go grab that from the internet. The issue is obviously the third-party updates. They're very specific to your environment. They've been code signed with your cert. So basically these first 3 errors where it can't find it is just 3 minutes of wasted time.
Yeah, and the wasted time is really going to kind of rear its ugly head, right, when you're doing multiple updates. So you can imagine a scenario where you're deploying out third-party updates for a whole host of apps, right? And even just five updates. We'll throw that out there. That's at a minimum 15 minutes, right? You're going to have content request failures like that 3 times with a minute delay for each of those updates, plus the time it takes to actually download the content and then run those installs. So especially in a work from home scenario that a lot of environments are in right now, you don't have as consistent of a time frame where you're getting content out to people. People are a lot more prone to close their laptop or do something similar that's going to potentially interrupt that. So it's not really a great scenario to be in. So that's definitely why we've kind of reached out to the product group to see what we can do to get it resolved.
So it looks like it might have fallen back now.
It did.
And we can see that's now installed. So if we look at that CCM cache folder and actually look where that downloaded, we'll be able to see a few kind of interesting things here. So one of those, for example, will be we can look at it actually code sign using your cert. So that's essentially why, it's not going to be able to go out and get it directly from, say, Google in this scenario, right? Because it is specific to your environment because it was code signed using that WSUS signing cert. And that's how your clients know, hey, this is trusted. This is coming from me. So we'll include a link in the video description. We'll have a user voice where if you want to vote that up. Hopefully this will be a quick fix. I'm not sure how complex it would be from a client side to, detect whether or not it's a third-party update versus a Microsoft update for the purposes of downloading and setting it to the internet, for example. But hopefully there'll be a fix there that just improves kind of that download time. But for now, everything will work fine. It just you may see the download does loop through 3 times. So it's something we want to make, our customers aware of in that scenario. But outside of that, do we have anything else, Cody? I think that covers pretty much things that you want to watch out for. We went through the deployment.
Yeah, and we've definitely seen some of these for the customer, when they're doing with these third-party updates. And it doesn't just apply to Patch My PC. It's anything third-party, whether you've got Dell catalogs or Adobe catalogs or whatever you're using. These pitfalls are still going to potentially be something that you've got to take into consideration.
Okay, cool. Well, I think that is all we have. So we'd like to thank you for watching, and we hope this has been helpful.
Thanks.